Hey, Mike Amundsen back here with again to talk more about designing and building great web APIs. I thought I'd spend a little bit of time on the Node framework that I'm using for all of the examples. And this is the framework I use for all of my sort of proof of concept API explorations. It's based on a pattern that I call data actions resource representation and transition, or the DARRT framework. So it's really a really simple way to get started. Let's go ahead and take a little peek at that. So here's actually my actual project here. It's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. It's got a series of folders in it. There's my assets. That's just some documentation and stuff like that. DARRT is the framework. We'll take a look at it. I store data locally. The index is worth taking a look at. Here, we'll just take a quick gander at the index. I'll just show you how simple it is to start. So I use the Express framework to start because it's so simple, it's so easy, and it's so accessible for anyone else. But the real magic happens in here in this line, where all of my resources are actually coming from this thing called DARRT resources. So after I start Express and support cores, because I use a lot of browser at remote, I just simply use the resources and then start listening. So it's pretty simple from the framework side. So that's the start. The real magic happens when I want to start looking at what's going on in that thing called DARRT. So let's just take a look at that for just a second here. So there's a handful of things in here. DARRT stands for Data, Actions, Representations, Resources, and Transitions. And there's really an idea behind separating all these pieces out and making the whole idea of setting up an API as declarative as possible. So let's just take a little quick tour of what this looks like. So this is my data elements definition. So if you looked at the way I do design work, I actually design properties and actions. So this is really the properties side of that puzzle. So this is me laying out exactly how the properties are going to look. So you can see there that I export a series of properties. That's the properties for this particular interface. This is a simple interface for identifying people or contacts. So ID and date created and date updated are stock elements that I have in all of my descriptions and all of my setups. Probably shouldn't even appear in this list of properties, but they do right now. And then I have other things: given name, family name, telephone, email, and status. I use status a lot as well. Notice I can set up what fields are required whenever you're interacting with writing on these interfaces. You're going to have to at least give me ID, email, and status. Also, status is an enumerated type, so I actually lay out the enumerated types here. We'll talk about enumerated types. They're both a main and a value to any API, so we can talk about that. Also, you can set up defaults with this framework. So if I don't supply a particular value, it will be set up as a default. Now, I've got a little example that I'll show you a little bit later about how that works in particular. So that's my data side. So the next thing in that list is the action side, the actions. So the properties or the data are what I depend on. The actions are what I act upon. So let me just show you what this looks like. So actions are literally function names or action names. So if you looked at the way we talked about design early on, we talked about design by designing this ideas about certain actions that you commit, that you expose, or capabilities. So that's what these are. So there's the home action, there's the create action, there's the list action, there's the filter action, so on and so forth. So these are very, very simple little elements that these are the actions that are going to be supported. Now you can see I'm using a simple promise pattern. So I take arguments or body types, and then I place those into a component, or I pass those down to a component where certain things happen. So you can see for the filter example that I take the query string, as long as I have a valid query string. I use whatever objects I have. I call an action called filter, and I pass on those filter values. We can talk more about this a little bit later, but I try to keep this relatively light. Create's a pretty interesting one. So I'll take the body that you send me, and I'll pass that body along. I want to do an add action in behind the scenes. And then I use those very data elements we talked about earlier. So the properties, the required elements, the enumerated elements, and the default elements all get sent along as well, because they'll be evaluated. I'll take the body and all of that declarative information about properties and then resolve that at some other point. So the actions level is very high level. It's just basically sort of tying things together. So that's fine. So I got properties and actions. The problem is you can see this is expecting things to come from a request body, and then actually deal with responses. Well, these actions don't have anything to do with HTTP yet. That happens somewhere else. And that happens in the resources side. So I'll go over to the resources element. And resources are actually where we talk about what we're going to do in terms of acceptance and response. A lot of my data types, my response types have metadata, like the author and the release and the date and time and things like that. So that's what that's for. I use this little middleware tracker. That's really not interesting. Here's where we get interesting. So here's where we actually map the express router routine, get from a particular URL, and then do certain things. So I have a series of arguments that I always pass into my system. So request, response, the action. Notice that the action at the root is called action home. The action for post is called action create, right? That makes perfect sense, right? And then there's some configuration elements like the metadata we talked about before, any templates for responses representation. I'll show you that in just a second. And any forms that are associated with it. And that filter has to do with what I'm going to filter out of my transitions. And I'll talk about transitions. That's going to be a little bit different here. So list, filter, all of these things should look pretty familiar. Here's a get for an ID. Here's a put for an ID. And again, I take the actions update. So I tie an action to a URL and a method. That's where this happens here, right? So I've got data, I've got actions. Now I've got resources that actually tie those actions to a URL and a method. So that starts to make sense, right? Still, this is very declarative. I just respond with whatever arguments have come along the way, and we'll talk about that response in the next step. So we've talked about data, we've talked about actions, and we've talked about resources. So there's a really important element in this, and that is the response side that I've been talking about earlier. And that is how we represent our response. So that's representations. So let's take a look at representation. This happens in 2 steps, actually. So the way we're going to represent information here is we're actually going to represent them as types, as internet types, as media types. That's the type system on the World Wide Web. The type system is the message format you send back, not the object. Customer is not the type that we share. What we share are application JSON, or a couple of formats that I've created called forms plus JSON or links plus JSON. There's a slightly different version of it called pragmatic JSON that I use, or text CSV. Right? So I'm going to declare these items and then put them into a collection. And that collection is what gets sent as responses. So we're going to actually match up what the HTTP header says. If it says, I accept application JSON, we're going to use JSON. I accept pragmatic JSON, we're going to use pragmatic JSON. So these are templates, or these are layouts, or these are formats. And actually, they're expressed as EJS templates. And we'll look at those in just a second. But setting up a representation service allows me to take the same data that I would have sent to you as HTML, but maybe send it to you as text CSV, or send it to you as application JSON, or send it to you as one of these hypermedia types. And that's a really important feature. I've actually decoupled the representation type from the data I'm sending you. And how do I do that? I'll actually do that with these things called representers. So representers are really these EJS templates that I use to set something up. So here's this typical, just simple response template for application JSON. So whatever the type is, so here this will say insert type customer or company or person or whatever the case may be, and then go through the collection, and for each of them, output the series of properties in that object. So you can see I've got a little curly brace that I start up, and then I start the whole process of outputting the state value and the item and whatever the request was, and it goes on and on. Now these are pretty fiddly. These are kind of annoying, I got to tell you. This is a simple one. It gets really annoying when you get into some of these more complicated ones that actually have to emit forms both at the page and the item level. So this gets kind of gnarly. So there's a lot of magic that happens in here. I wish this was a little bit better, but right now it's not. The good news is it works, and it's totally open and accessible. So this idea of representations is a way for me to use the type system of the internet, of the World Wide Web, these media types, to respond with the same data. Give me the sales figures as HTML. Give me the sales figures as CSV. Give me the sales figures as application JSON. And I make that sort of cheap and easy. So the last thing in the DART model, data actions resource representation, is transition. So a big part of the web is the idea of using transitions. So transitions are how we get from one stage to the next, how we change the state of the service if using state machines, or to keep it simple, they're the links and forms that appear in HTML pages. So here is where we actually come up with links and forms for our work. And I just call them all forms. Sometimes they're just simple links. You can see here, this is the self transition. It's named self. There's a little macro that puts the full URL in here, and it has rels. And these tags are for filters. We talked about these filters earlier. Whenever you're doing a collection or a home or a list or an item, you're going to include a self tag, right? Here's the home, which tells you certain things about the collection. Here's the list item. Here's the filter. Here's an interesting one about the filter. So not only does the filter have a name and an href and a title, it has a method and it has certain properties. So if I want to show somebody the filter form, I'm going to show them the status field and the family name, because right now this API is set up to filter on status and family name. Create's a little bit different. When you want to create a record using post, you're going to be able to do a couple of different things here. So I've got ID and given name and family name and telephone and email and status all happening inside this post, right? So that's how I do creates. You can see one for reads. You can see one for getting status. There are all these things that work together. So these are the transitions. So data, actions, resources, representations, and transitions all add up to giving us the API that we're looking for. So that's really what the DART framework looks like. And it's really just part of this whole idea of creating APIs in a very declarative, simple kind of way. So now if I exit out of here and I just want to take a little run at here, npm run dev, we're just going to run this. We've talked about this earlier. I keep a short little routine that makes it easy for me to create a sort of a node version of this. So now I can simply say, curl localhost 8181, and this is going to give me a simple feedback, right? So this is going to be that list and that's that early representation. If I want to actually get a list, I can get that list here. It's a little hard to see here, but this is just a series of records. If I want to actually see this, this is actually defaulting in this JSON format. So if I want to see this in a different format, I can just simply say list and then offer a header for accept application forms plus JSON. And then I'm going to get this information back. And along with that information, I'm going to get tags. So you can't really tell this here. Let me go ahead and put this to output.json here. And then we'll vim the output, right? So now you can see how this actually looks. So there's my metadata. There are my links that we talked about, the self, the home. Notice that they're filled in with details. Let's see if we can find our filter. There's our filter example. There's our create example, right? It actually generates a brand new ID for you. It allows you to also use the default for pending status. So all of this stuff comes automatically for free. Right? So all I did is I changed the type that I want to use, and then I get the response that I'm looking for. So that's a big part of this system. So it's all based on this idea of DART. Now, in some upcoming screencasts, we'll talk about how you can actually start from zero with the API starter kit that uses DART and also modify the existing system. So hopefully that gives you some ideas about what we're working on when we design and build great web APIs. Looking forward to your feedback. Catch the bug at the top. You'll see a bunch of other related elements to the series, and I'll see you again next time soon.